In 2002, Sony announced the release of a highly unusual kit for what remains their most popular video game console to date, PlayStation 2. The kit, called Linux Kit, was designed to transform a kid's gaming console into a really useful device, a fully fledged workstation running the Linux operating system.
At least, that's what the press release claimed. We'll definitely be discussing just how fully fledged it was a little later.
The kit came in a box that was almost 1.5 times larger than the PS2 packaging itself. Initially, it was exclusively available in Japan, and today we're taking a look at the very first Japanese version of it. Sony originally planned to produce only 2,000 of these kits and distribute them solely within Japan. During the development of Linux Kit, it was envisioned only for research purposes within Sony itself and for developers from friendly companies. No one could have imagined that such an unusual kit might pique the interest of people outside the gaming industry. But at some point, Sony decided to gauge demand for this project not only among developers, but also among enthusiasts in the domestic market. The demand turned out to be so high that in Japan alone, the final production count was not 2,000, but 7,900 Linux kits.
By today's standards, that number might seem modest. But let's be honest, the expansion set was, to put it mildly, quite niche.
After its release in Japan, Sony decided to test the waters and see if anyone in the West might want this as well. As it turned out, 28,000 people from Europe and the US expressed interest in purchasing the kit through Sony's official website. As far as I understand, the offer wasn't extended to other regions. I couldn't find exact numbers on how many kits were ultimately produced for PAL and NTSCU regions. However, judging by the fact that prices for just the DVD from the Western version start at $200 on eBay and full kits are virtually impossible to find for sale, I'd guess the production numbers were, if not less than in Japan, then certainly not much more. Moreover, demand exceeded supply, and Sony ended the project without fulfilling all the orders. I suspect this had a lot to do with the release of the PS3 in 2006, the first models of which also supported Linux out of the box.
But that's a story for another episode.
In 2009, the Linux Kit project was shut down for good. Even its official website, which hosted projects for PS2 Linux, went offline. Thankfully, enthusiasts managed to create a mirror of the site, which is still accessible to this day. According to news preserved on the mirror, all Linux kits in the US and Canada were sold out not by the project's closure in 2009, but as early as July 2004. There's not a ton of useful info on that site, but having personally dealt with PS2 Linux in 2024, I have to admit, it's practically the only resource that offers even a hint of guidance on the subject. So, thanks for that at least. And today, thanks to my amazing subscribers, one of these kits, along with the Japanese PS2 necessary to run it, is sitting right here on my desk. And despite wondering what I've gotten myself into, I want to welcome you to the channel.
Hello guys and gals, it's been a while. My name is Victor, and you're once again watching the Russian Video Game Comrade show.
Yes, I'm far from the first person to bring up the topic of Linux for PlayStation 2 on YouTube. However, if you search for Linux Kit PlayStation 2 videos, you'll notice that most of them simply feature bloggers showing off the box and its contents. Afterwards, the host says something like, "Look, I have a Linux kit for the PS2, let's install it." The person installs the OS and then
Almost all of these videos end with something like, "Look, I installed Linux on my PS2. Well, thanks. Color me impressed."
the most you'll see after that is the creator launching X Window System, showing that the kit comes with GIMP and a text editor and wrapping up the video. And when I watch this, I can't help but ask, why did you even bother installing it? What's next? Should I just make videos where I install macOS on an original Macintosh or Windows on an x86 PC? Just install it and say, "Hey look, there's Notepad, Paint and Minesweeper, top tier content, like and subscribe." What's the point of that? Spend $600 in the 21st century for the kit just to show the installer?
Spoiler alert! Now I understand why this happens. Because getting anything to run on this system today is quite a challenge, and nobody wants to deal with it or admit they just can't do it.
When I click on a video like that, I'm curious. Can this incredible device actually be used for anything? Or is its entire functionality reduced to barely running a free Photoshop alternative on the PS2? Is that what tens of thousands of people wanted to buy it for in the early 2000s?
I seriously doubt that.
If you dig just a little deeper into online sources, you can find some very intriguing historical precedents. For example, there's the story of how the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in the US purchased 70 PS2 consoles with Linux kits in 2003 to build a cluster for scientific computations. Unfortunately, organizations like that don't share details, not about the software they used, let alone the specifics of the calculations. At least we've got a photo of it. Still, someone found a use for this peculiar technology. But why the PS2 instead of regular computers or servers? My guess is the price-to-performance ratio. According to a New York Times article from the same 2003, a cluster of 70 PS2 consoles could handle nearly 500 billion operations per second. At the time, a single PS2 console cost $199, and the Linux kit added another $200. Multiply $400 by 70, and you get $28,000 for the cluster. For comparison, let's Google the top consumer processor in 2003. The AMD Athlon 64F X51 running at 2.2 GHz. According to its datasheet, this single-core processor could theoretically handle about 6.8 million operations per second. To reach 500 billion operations using these CPUs, you'd need around 74 of them. Each processor cost $733 in 2003. So, to build a comparable cluster with those CPUs, you'd be spending $54,000 just on the processors.
And you do realize that processors alone don't make a functional cluster, right?
Another example. In June 2003, Abertay University in Scotland set up an entire computer lab filled with these Linux-equipped PS2 machines for students in their computer games technology department. Unfortunately, there's no information about what they were actually using them for, or if it led to any notable outcomes for the students. But the fact remains, someone genuinely used these systems as intended. What's amusing though, is that under each desk in that lab, there were also regular PCs, just in case, which says a lot by the fact itself.
Still, the mere existence of such initiatives shows that Linux for PS2 wasn't just another toy. It was genuinely an interesting and ambitious project.
And yes, in the 21st century, aside from the official Linux kits, which only work on fat PS2 models, there are also fan-made builds of Linux, primarily designed for slim PS2 models. These fan builds, thanks to software mods like FreeMCBoot, can even be installed on unmodded consoles. That's a separate topic though, and one we'll need to touch on today as well.
Because Sony being Sony, of course.
But let's start with the official kit, which was sold worldwide, more or less, in the early 2000s. Thanks to my amazing subscribers who funded its purchase for this video, I now have it here to examine and share with you. We bought it in Japan for around $600. There are two boxes here, one containing a Japanese PS2 model SCPH 10000 and the other containing the Linux kit itself. Let's start with the PS2. Besides regional restrictions, the PS2 models also differ technically. For today's purposes, the main difference is the expansion bay. If we look at my old PAL console and check its back, we'll see a large expansion bay. This bay is designed to house a network adapter, which can connect to a standard IDE hard drive. Originally, this setup was meant for things like online gaming. For example, Final Fantasy XI for PlayStation 2 came bundled with a hard drive. Now, if we look at an early Japanese PS2 like the one I bought, instead of the large expansion bay, you'll find a much smaller PC card slot on the back. The hard drive included in the Linux kit connects to this slot. Essentially, it's a PCMCIA slot, but the card itself is slightly thicker because it also contains an Ethernet adapter in addition to the hard drive controller. This means that this specific Japanese Linux kit won't work with a PAL or NTSCU console. You need an early Japanese PS2 model. Now, onto the second box, the Linux kit itself. Inside, there's a ton of paperwork, nothing too exciting, and the Linux installation DVD. Notably, this is one of the earliest releases labeled as beta. I suspect that some of the issues I've encountered with it stem from this, but come on, this was a commercial release. You sold this thing, so what the heck were you thinking?
Sorry, that's a meme from the future. You won't understand it yet, but eventually we'll come back to it.
One of the rarest and most practical items in this kit is the official adapter that converts the PS2's AV output to VGA, allowing you to connect the console to a monitor and get a decent resolution rather than blurry composite video. The peripherals, like the mouse and keyboard, however, seem to be fairly standard. They connect via USB, and you can substitute them with any other devices as long as they support the outdated USB 1.1 standard. Quick note, the included mouse in my kit turned out to be defective. The left button doesn't work. Fortunately, I was able to replace it without issue using an old USB Genius mouse I had lying around. The kit also includes a large white box housing the hard drive. Inside, there's a separate power supply, as the hard drive connects to its own outlet. The PCMCIA card is another key component. Note its thickness. It's twice as thick as a standard PCMCIA card because it contains not only the hard drive connector, but also an RJ45 Ethernet port. The hard drive itself is encased in a sturdy enclosure and is just a standard 40GB IDE hard disk drive. Assembling the kit creates what looks like a stylish yet wildly asymmetrical sandwich. To get it all running, you'll need a 4:3 monitor with a VGA port, all the necessary cables, and, crucially, a memory card. Interestingly, you cannot boot Linux on the PS2 without a memory card, but the kit doesn't include one. I bought a compatible card for a couple bucks, as they're still readily available on local marketplaces. With everything set up, it's time to power on our beast of a machine.
Only to face immediate disappointment, because by default the PS2 won't output anything via VGA.
To get a picture, you first need to connect the console using composite cable and go into the PS2's menu to switch the video output to component signal.
And also, you'll need a monitor that supports sync on green.
Most monitors use 5 signals, one each for red, green and blue, and 2 more for horizontal and vertical sync. Sync on green monitors, however, use only 3 signals, red, blue and green. The green channel carries both the green signal and the synchronization signals. Naturally, this complicates things. For example, my BenQ monitor supports sync on green, but Sony engineers didn't modify the PS2 entirely to accommodate a limited Linux kit. Instead, sync on green is only activated when forced by an application. So, when you insert the Linux disk, the installer tells the PS2 to output sync on green via VGA. However, in situations like the BIOS startup screen, where you'd see the Sony logo or the memory card menu, the PS2 outputs a different signal that many monitors, including mine, can't interpret. I do have another monitor that handles this, but it also has its own other quirks. Plus, it's a modern monitor that didn't exist when Linux Kit was released in 2002. Back in 2002, getting this setup to work required either an additional TV to configure the PS2 before launching Linux, or a lot of trial and error to find a compatible monitor. This solution was such a convoluted headache for the average person in the early 2000s that it's hard to describe without resorting to hyperbole. Let's just say this was not designed for the masses.
I guess I paid for the lesson, not the device.
Then the next bit of fun began. This time because everything we bought was either used, like the console, or so old that even if it sat unused for over 20 years, it just started falling apart. Real Japanese quality, right? The DVD drive in the PS2 I bought from Japanese Yahoo auctions was on its last legs, barely reading discs, when it did at all, and only on the 3rd attempt if I was lucky. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Even when I managed to load the installer, the gamepad, keyboard, or sometimes both at the same time wouldn't work. At one point, maybe on the 10th attempt, I even managed to select install in the very first menu. But on the next screen, where you choose the language, the keyboard stubbornly refused to respond. Since I'm also both persistent and stubborn, I kept replugging the keyboard and gamepad and rebooting the console over and over. And maybe on the 50th attempt, the installation managed to proceed a few steps before errors flooded the screen and the DVD drive began making some truly ungodly noises. At that point, I realized that 90% of the problem was the console itself. If I wanted anything to work, I'd need another PlayStation 2 for this video.
It's a charm one of my friends had one of the same kind in his console collection.
Now, armed with 3 PS2 consoles, I could finally try to install the operating system from the kit, proudly declare, "Look, I installed Linux on a PlayStation 2," and wrap up the video like everyone does, right?
If only it were that simple.
The actual installation process for Linux is straightforward, almost like installing Windows, except for one key difference. You need to manually create 2 partitions on the hard drive. Swap partition, a modest 128 megabytes, is enough for this ancient version of Linux. And main partition, this will house the system and everything else. Then it's the usual stuff: hostname, time zone, username, password, nothing worth dwelling on. And here's where it gets interesting. To run Linux on the PS2, you need a separate memory card for the boot sector. But if you think this means the PS2 will boot entirely from the memory card, cool your jets. That would be too simple. And it might compromise the PS2's security, blah blah blah. By the time the Linux kit was released, the PS2 security had long since been broken with mod chips. A few years later, FreeMacBoot exploited another vulnerability. Not in Linux, as some mistakenly believe, but in the DVD player, which didn't exist in the earliest PS2 models. So the only thing they've got with all the stuff they did, they made PS2 Linux enthusiasts suffer. Here's how it actually works. Linux boots from the memory card, but you can only start the boot process after inserting the official Linux DVD into the PS2. Could they have come up with a more convoluted system of hacks and workarounds? Absolutely. Sony could always find ways to make things even more cumbersome, because security is above all the other nonsense, including usability.
And this is when we officially entered hold onto your head territory.
The installation process is quite lengthy and not particularly eventful, but eventually, after what feels like an eternity, it will finish. After a reboot, you'll be greeted with a console interface, a fairly standard Linux system at first glance, running a prehistoric kernel version 2.2.1. PS2 Linux is a variation of the Japanese Kondara Linux, which itself is based on the Red Hat distributive. Back in the early 2000s, its key features were built-in Japanese language support and a focus on graphical applications. This version is compiled specifically for the MIPS processor in the PS2, clocked at a blazing 294 MHz. For those curious, the PS2 has a whopping 32 megs of RAM. Yes, it includes X Window System, but in my beta version of PS2 Linux, nothing else significant is pre-installed. Showing off text editors, basic file managers, or GIMP would just be pointless. So I'm not going to do that.
Here we are. Linux is installed on the PlayStation 2. Now comes the big question. What's next?
Logically, the next step would be to run something on it. And I think this is exactly where most YouTubers hit a wall in their videos. They either didn't want to explain the reasons behind their failure, or just didn't want to admit they couldn't figure out what to do with this glorified pile of junk.
And me? I'm fine with the fact the wheels are coming off the thing. I'm just here for the ride.
What can we try to run here? Ideally, something precompiled, because compiling anything yourself for this ancient kernel on a MIPS processor in a long-dead distro without modern libraries, yeah, you get the idea. As I mentioned earlier, the official PlayStation Linux site is long gone, but enthusiasts managed to create a mirror of the site which is still online today. It hosts various community projects, including compilers, additional libraries, and even games. I downloaded a few pre-built projects from there. Now we just need to transfer them to the PS2's hard drive. How? The first idea that comes to mind is absurdly simple. We've got a full-fledged machine with a DVD drive and even USB ports, right? So why not burn the software onto a disk and copy it to the console? Sounds logical?
For a normal person, yes, but not for the geniuses at Sony. Why? You know why. Security.
Here's what happens when you try to mount a DVD-ROM with a burnt DVD inserted. Illegal content, low-level request lockout. This piece of garbage curs its Japanese creators, checks whether the disc is licensed before even attempting to mount it. Is this some kind of joke? I'm not inserting a bootleg game. I'm trying to transfer user files to a computer. For the mother of God. And in case you were wondering, yes, if I insert, say, an official licensed Linux disk, it mounts just fine and shows the contents. What about an USB flash drive? Of course, the official Linux won't mount it. The USB ports are locked for security, usable only for keyboards and mice, because security is above all else.
Now in 2025, you might think of another idea. Fine, you've blocked the DVD and USB drives. But the console has another data storage, the memory card.
In 2003, this was just a proprietary device for saving game progress. Technically though, it's just an 8 meg flash drive. And in 2025, using a file manager like on FreeMacBoot, you can write data to it and try transferring it to Linux on the console, right? Right. But Sony anticipated this as well. Just like with DVDs, any data written by the Linux installer is fully accessible. You can ls it without issue. But anything else you copy manually? The system pretends it doesn't exist. The system can see that the card has data on it. It shows the amount of space used and free. But as for interacting with those files?
Well, you can go for kindly see yourself out.
So, you might ask, how do you work on such a computer? If, for instance, you make something in the built-in GIMP, how do you transfer it somewhere else? I'd like to know that too. If you'll watch videos on YouTube, you'll see that later versions of Linux solve this, at least partially, via internet connectivity. There are even videos where someone browses the web on a PS2 using the official Linux kit. In my case, internet on the console doesn't work. The ifconfig command, this version of Linux doesn't recognize it. The ip command, same result. I tried netstat, which showed some connections, but the console doesn't receive an IP address via DHCP. The official FAQ says all you need to do is enable DHCP in netconfig, and everything will work. Want to guess what happens when you try to run netconfig? That's right, command not found. This was marketed as a full-fledged commercial product, yet it doesn't work. So why was this even released?
Well, at least it's shiny and makes a nice paperweight.
Yes, judging by the video I mentioned earlier, this issue was fixed in version 1.0. The author of that video has the American 2-disc version 1.0. Based on what I've googled, in Japan, the update from the beta to version 1.0 was mailed out to original kit purchasers a couple of months later. But seriously, how does something like this beta even exist? And more importantly, why? While updated version images are available online, thanks to Sony's relentless DRM, I can't just download one and update my Linux on an unmodded Japanese PS2. Interestingly, even though the network connectivity works for the author in the video, content in it is still limited to showcasing a downloaded browser and the same GIMP. Does it mean that nothing else works even in the newer version? I really wanted to figure this out myself. So, I thought of one more way to transfer the needed data to PS2 Linux. Inside this black box lies an ordinary IDE hard drive. So what's stopping us from carefully removing it, connecting it to a PC, and using something like a Linux Live CD to upload whatever we need directly? Surely it uses the ext2 file system, right?
Well, security stops us.
PC recognizes Sony's hard drive as formatted with some kind of raw partition. ext2? Wishful thinking. Do you think they rewrote Condara Linux with obsessive restrictions just so you could hook up the drive to your PC and play around? No chance. It's highly likely PS2 Linux uses an early version of Sony's proprietary PFS PlayStation file system. An updated version of this file system is reportedly still in use today, for example, for PlayStation 4 content. Even though information about PS2 Linux is hard to find in 2025, I did manage to locate a Windows XP driver for initializing this file system. However, it's intended not for Linux, but for transferring game images to a hard drive for the network adapter. Even that driver, unfortunately, didn't allow me to read the PS2 Linux hard drive. Another dead end. I even found a hacked hard drive image with a pre-installed updated version of PS2 Linux and instructions for manually deploying it on a hard drive. It included all the necessary files and was pre-formatted in ext2. But sadly, I couldn't get it to boot. After a few attempts, the hard drive from the Linux kit physically failed. Yes, a brand new hard drive from a decades-old kit. Sure, it's been sitting around for 20+ years, but I have plenty of older drives that I use regularly, and they still work perfectly. Not this one, though.
If you think this setback stopped me, think again.
What's funny is that the solution we're about to discuss wasn't even born out of Sony's draconian restrictions on Linux kits, but rather because enthusiasts were frustrated that the official Linux kit only worked on fat PS2 models and wasn't supported on the PS2 Slim. In 2008, when the PS2 had been mostly forgotten and everyone had moved on to tinkering with the PS3, a developer known as Mega Man released a tool called Kernel Loader. This tool, combined with FreeMcBoot or a mod chip, allowed Linux to run on any PS2 model, and not just from a hard drive, but even from a regular USB flash drive. Running Linux from a flash drive wasn't ideal due to the PS2's USB 1.1 ports, which are painfully slow. But it worked, and since my hard drive is dead, this is the route we're going to take. Kernel Loader also opened the door to running not just Sony's proprietary Linux, but also community-ported distributions. The most famous of these is BlackRhino, which we'll be installing today. This distro features a 2.4.17 kernel and possibly newer versions, which isn't groundbreaking but still a significant improvement. Most importantly, it provides better tools for managing data on the console, which is a real game changer.
Why my clumsy hands can make a full use of it remains to be seen, but it's really worth a try.
To install it, you'll need to spend some time with the guides, though there aren't that many available. For someone not well acquainted with Unix systems, these guides can feel chaotic. However, if I managed it, you can too, with a bit of determination. I'll include a link to a relatively up-to-date video guide that helped me in the description for those interested. Be prepared to think things through as you go. In short, you'll need the distributions, some additional files from the Kernel Loader's SourceForge page, a memory card with FreeMcBoot, and a compatible flash drive. The flash drive needs to be formatted and partitioned using Linux in a specific way, creating swap, boot, and main partitions. Afterward, you'll need to copy all the necessary data onto it properly, as well as anything else you might need personally. Once that's done, plug the flash drive into any PS2, along with a FreeMcBoot memory card, or use a CD loader if your console is modded, connect a keyboard and mouse and run a few pre-prepared scripts. I used my PAL PS2 as FreeMcBoot doesn't work very well on early Japanese models. You might also notice that in the video, I'm now using a regular TV connected via RCA cables instead of a monitor. Yes, that's correct. This fan-made build gave me even more headaches with video output than the original kit. While Kernel Loader has settings for display type and resolution, my monitor, which works with practically everything over VGA, kept going out of range as soon as Linux started booting. I considered just running the test on the TV, but the problem is that working with RCA connections is basically impossible. Look at the text on the screen. Ridiculous, isn't it? After digging through about 10 more manuals, I managed to configure the output to work with VGA. However, the resolution only applied to the console. When launching X applications, the resolution reverted to something very low. Not as awful as RCA, but still far below what the PS2 Linux is capable of. To make matters worse, there's no xorg.conf in the X11 folder to tweak.
So I apologize for the less than pleasant visuals. I did everything I could, but even my capture card refused to accept such a resolution.
Finally, we've gained access to a system we can transfer files to, so we'll have at least an attempt to run something. I've downloaded about 5 small indie games, written by enthusiasts for PS2 Linux. And guess what?
None of them worked.
All of these games were created around 2005 and were supposed to run on the original Linux kit. But there's a catch. In addition to blocking external devices, guess what else Sony decided to restrict? That's right, access to the console's hardware. Specifically, direct access to the graphics processing modules.
Once again, I'm left wondering, why and for whom was this official Linux even made?
But programmer Steven Osman bypassed this limitation and wrote a module called SPS2, which allowed direct access to PS2 hardware. The issue is that there were multiple versions of this module, and for BlackRhino, the only compiled version available online now is the latest 0.50. I tried to compile earlier versions, but unfortunately couldn't. The system kept complaining about missing components, one after another. As you can imagine, finding the necessary libraries for the niche PS2 Linux environment today is nearly impossible. Even the scraps I managed to dig up outside the official site's mirrors felt like a small victory, given how obscure this whole topic is. All the pre-compiled projects I downloaded were built for version 0.40, and when I tried to run them, they either complained about the module version or couldn't detect the connected gamepad, even though naturally the gamepad was connected. When running the demos included with the latest version of the module, everything works fine. Cubes render, textures load, particles cascade, and shapes merge seamlessly. The module itself installs perfectly and operates well. But there are no game projects available for this version, or at least none that have survived in open access. Perhaps if I had a bit more programming experience, spoiler, I have none, I could have fixed this or even written something of my own.
But we can't just end things here without even running Doom, right? Otherwise, what was all this effort for?
If we turn to existing YouTube videos, there's at least one video where the author claims to have run Doom natively on PS2 Linux, supposedly by compiling PRBoom for Mipsel. I'd love to be proven wrong, but here's the thing. In his series of videos, the author shows the Linux interface in detail, including running the built-in BlackRhino browser and connecting an iToy, which BlackRhino supports out of the box. However, when it comes to Doom, there's no setup process shown, just a clip of PRBoom gameplay running a random WAD with noticeable stuttering. The video doesn't show what's connected to the monitor or how it's being controlled. Suspiciously, the game is also running at a very high resolution. I'm not accusing the author of this being fake, but let's put it this way. I have some second thoughts on this part of the video. Again, I'd be thrilled to be wrong.
Additionally, there's another point to consider.
A native fan port of Doom for the PS2 exists, not through Linux, but as a standalone ELF application. It runs off a flash drive via FreeMcBoot and works flawlessly on the PS2, with full speed and support for any WAD files. This isn't surprising, considering the first Doom was officially released for the PS1 and ran quite well there too. If, for some reason, you absolutely must play Doom on a PS2, you don't need to bother with all this Linux struggle. Just copy the ELF and your desired WAD to a flash drive, and you're good to go. As for this cursed PS2 Linux setup, freed from most of its official restrictions but still frustrating, I couldn't come up with anything better than adding yet another workaround to this gloriously convoluted project, already packed with hacks courtesy of Sony.
BlackRhino comes with DOSBox.
And yes, this is the most absurd idea one could come up with, but technically, I just have to run Doom on Linux on the PlayStation 2. It's not like Doom was ever designed to be played on a pregnancy test or a MacBook's touch bar either. The suffering begins with the loading process. Just getting from DOS to the game menu takes about 3.5 minutes. That's just from pressing Save and Run Doom in the setup to seeing the title screen. And it doesn't stop there. To actually get into the game requires even more patience. First, you need to use the menu, which takes about 5 seconds to respond to every input, to set the screen size to something small. Otherwise, the in-game frame rate will be abysmal. Then, you fumble through some options and finally start the game. And, ladies and gentlemen, Doom on Linux for the PlayStation 2.
Technically, I did it. Don't care what anyone says. I launched Doom on a PS2 Linux.
Of course, x86 emulation on such a slow MIPS processor is going to perform poorly. It's a ridiculous exercise. This hardware was never meant for such tasks, not in terms of design, architecture, or the rudimentary operating system running the emulator. Sure, with effort, you could optimize it to perform slightly better. But let's be honest, no sane person in 2025 needs this. As it stands, this is emulation on an almost 300 MHz processor that performs worse than a native 10 MHz x86 CPU. For comparison, I tried running some other games that would work fine on an Intel 8088. Commander Keen, the first EGA Leisure Suit Larry, even Wolfenstein 3D in CGA. These games run smoothly on retro PCs, but on the PS2, no. Despite Wolfenstein even renders more frames than Doom, it's still unplayable. Interestingly, the biggest issue isn't just the low FPS, but the input lag. Even simple games like Commander Keen feel sluggish and unresponsive.
If you're wondering why am I doing all this, the answer is simple. Because I can. The motivation is always the same. It's fun, quirky nonsense.
In 2025, Linux on the PS2 is utterly pointless. I'm not even sure it made much sense when it was first released, unless you were running a computational center with a team of programmers and custom software that needed a cheap supercomputer to calculate moon phases in Mercury. You'd think this setup might have been useful for PS2 game developers. But no, due to the severe hardware restrictions, it wasn't suitable for that either. Game developers had dedicated dev kit models for the PS2, just like any other console.
As for purchasing one today,
the official Linux disk might make an interesting collector's item for a shelf, and the original VGA adapter, while niche, could be genuinely useful for retro gaming. With it, you can enjoy sharp visuals on original hardware for games that support progressive scan. While there aren't as many PS2 games supporting 480p compared to the original Xbox or GameCube, the difference in image quality between 480p and standard resolution is striking. Even recording a monitor's display with a camera, you can see the improvement. Let's not forget that the PS2 has a whopping 4 games that support 1080i resolution. Gran Turismo 4, for example, looks almost like a PS3 game. I hope you enjoyed this look at another obscure and practically useless piece of tech. Personally, I love these kinds of things, even when they cause me physical pain to tinker with. It's a shame I couldn't run any of the fan-made projects on it, but unlike those I bought Linux for PS2 YouTube videos, at least I explained why. Let's hope my next obscure hardware venture already on its way will be more successful.
thank you for watching today's episode. I really hope you liked it. Please press thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Have a nice day, good luck!